The moment a man reveals that he is controlled by his appetite, he loses respect from others. A man believes that chasing what he wants will make him powerful. He believes that showing interest proves confidence, but the strange truth of human nature is that power rarely belongs to the person who wants something the most. In The Prince he wrote, men are driven by two principal impulses, either by love or by fear, but what he quietly observed in the courts of Florence was something deeper. Love, admiration, attraction, all these emotions tend to flow toward the individual who is not desperate for them. The moment a man begins chasing pleasure with visible urgency, the invisible balance of power shifts. What once might have been curiosity toward him becomes quiet control over him. Most men never notice the exact moment when this shift occurs. They believe they are simply pursuing romance, pleasure, or excitement. But from the outside, something else becomes visible. Their attention becomes predictable. Their decisions become negotiable. Their boundaries become flexible. And every time a man shows that he can be steered by lust, he quietly announces something about himself to the world, that he can be influenced, that he can be distracted, that he can be controlled. Machiavelli would have recognized this instantly. The courts he studied were full of men who lost fortunes, titles, and even kingdoms because they could not master their desires. They did not lose because they were weak in battle or foolish in politics. They lost because someone discovered the simplest lever of influence that exists in human nature: lust. A man ruled by lust does not require chains. He will walk willingly into the trap, convinced that the pursuit itself proves his freedom. In modern life, the same mechanism repeats itself in quieter forms. A man rearranges his priorities to gain approval. He spends his attention where it is least valued. He begins performing versions of himself in order to attract someone else's interest. At first, the changes feel harmless, but gradually, something subtle begins to disappear. His independence becomes conditional, his time becomes negotiable, his self-respect begins to depend on reactions he cannot control. And the strange irony is that the more visible this desire becomes, the less respect it produces. People instinctively understand hierarchy. They observe where attention flows and who controls it. The man who constantly seeks validation from women, from pleasure, from admiration, communicates something without speaking. That these things hold authority over him, and once authority is visible, respect begins to fade. Machiavelli once wrote, "It is much safer to be feared than loved if one must lack one of the two." This statement is often misunderstood. He was not praising cruelty. He was describing the mechanics of power. Respect does not grow from pleasing others endlessly. It grows from demonstrating that your actions are guided by your own principles, rather than by the hunger for approval or pleasure. This is why the man who denies lust begins to change the atmosphere around him. When temptation appears and he remains calm, something unexpected happens. People begin to watch him differently. The same energy that once made him predictable now makes him difficult to read. Desire no longer pulls him in obvious directions. The usual levers of influence no longer work. And in that moment, something rare begins to emerge, authority that comes from self-control. History is filled with men who possessed talent but lost influence because they could not control their appetites. Their enemies rarely needed elaborate strategies. They simply waited for the predictable moment when desire would cloud judgment. Machiavelli observed this pattern repeatedly. In the courts of Italy, men who could command armies would surrender their dignity for fleeting pleasure, and every time it happened, the same quiet lesson revealed itself again. The man who cannot master himself will eventually be mastered by someone else. This is why denying lust is not about moral purity or rigid discipline for its own sake. It is about independence. The moment a man proves that pleasure does not control his decisions, he changes the psychological balance of every interaction around him. He becomes someone whose attention cannot be easily purchased, whose focus cannot be easily redirected, whose behavior cannot be easily predicted. And in a world where most people are driven by impulses they barely understand, that level of control begins to look like power. The paradox is almost cruel. The more a man chases desire, the more ordinary he becomes. But the moment he stops being governed by it, something else begins to grow in its place. His presence becomes heavier, his choices become deliberate, his silence begins to carry more meaning than another man's endless pursuit. And without announcing it, without demanding it, without even seeking it, he begins to receive something that men who chase pleasure rarely experience: respect. But the deeper transformation begins when a man realizes that denying lust does not simply change how others see him, it changes how he sees the world itself. And once that shift occurs, the games that once controlled him begin to lose their power entirely. Because the man who has mastered desire has discovered something that Machiavelli quietly understood centuries ago: the greatest form, greatest of power, is not controlling others. Machiavelli believed that the greatest weakness of rulers was not external enemies, but internal disorder. A prince who could not govern his own impulses would eventually lose the ability to govern anything else. In Discourses on Livy he wrote, "The first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him." But behind that observation was a deeper truth. The first method for estimating the strength of a man is to observe what controls his decisions. If his attention is constantly pulled by pleasure, approval, or lust, then those forces quietly rule him. This is why denial of lust creates such a powerful shift in perception. When a man is no longer visibly driven by desire, he becomes difficult to manipulate. People sense this even if they cannot explain it. The usual signals that guide social interactions stop working. Flotation loses its leverage, attention loses its bargaining power, and without these familiar tools, those who once expected influence suddenly find themselves uncertain. It is not that the man becomes cold or distant. In fact, the opposite often happens. When desire no longer dominates his thinking, his presence becomes calmer, more deliberate. He listens more carefully, he observes more deeply, he speaks less but with greater precision. The frantic energy that once surrounded him disappears, replaced by a quiet stability that most people rarely encounter. And here is the irony Machiavelli would have appreciated. The moment a man stops chasing admiration, admiration begins to move toward him. The moment he stops competing for attention, attention begins to notice him differently. This is not magic or manipulation. It is the simple psychology of scarcity. People value what appears difficult to influence. They respect what cannot be easily steered by impulse. Think about the men who command the most authority in any environment, the leaders whose presence immediately changes the room. They are rarely the loudest, rarely the most eager to please, rarely the ones visibly pursuing pleasure or validation. Instead, they carry themselves with a certain restraint. Their attention is selective, their reactions are measured. They give the impression that their decisions come from a deeper place than immediate gratification. This restraint is not weakness. It is discipline, and discipline, when practiced consistently, creates a form of power that is impossible to imitate without genuine self-control. Many men attempt to project confidence through appearance or words, but the illusion quickly collapses the moment temptation appears. When desire takes control, the performance ends and the truth becomes visible. Machiavelli's world was full of such performances. Ambitious men filled the courts with speeches about honor, loyalty, and virtue. But the moment pleasure or advantage appeared, their behavior revealed their true priorities. Machiavelli observed these patterns with a ruthless clarity. He saw how easily men could be redirected when someone understood their weaknesses. He saw how reputations could be dismantled by exposing the impulses men believed they had hidden. What he learned from these observations was simple. The man who cannot be tempted easily becomes difficult to defeat, not because he is immune to desire, but because he refuses to allow desire to govern his decisions. That distinction changes everything. In modern life, the battlefield is different, but the psychology is exactly the same. Temptations appear in new forms: endless attention, instant gratification, digital admiration, the illusion of limitless options. But the principle remains unchanged. The more visibly a man chases these things, the easier he becomes to predict. And the easier he becomes to predict, the easier he becomes to influence. But when a man denies lust, something fascinating happens to his priorities. Time becomes more valuable. Attention becomes more selective. His goals begin to expand beyond momentary satisfaction toward long-term purpose. Instead of reacting to every opportunity for pleasure, he begins directing his energy toward things that build strength, reputation, and independence. This shift rarely happens overnight. At first, the discipline feels uncomfortable. The mind searches for the familiar rewards it once relied on. but gradually, the man begins to experience a different kind of satisfaction. The satisfaction of control. Each moment of restraint becomes evidence that he is no longer ruled by impulse. Each decision made from clarity rather than desire strengthens the foundation of his independence. Machiavelli would have called this strategic strength, not the strength of physical force or aggressive dominance, but the strength of self-governance. A man who governs himself effectively cannot be easily governed by others. His attention cannot be purchased cheaply. His loyalty cannot be redirected through momentary pleasures. His judgment remains stable even when others attempt to provoke him. This is why the denial of lust produces something far more valuable than fleeting satisfaction. It produces gravity. A psychological weight that makes a man's presence more significant without him needing to demand recognition. People begin to listen more carefully. They take his decisions more seriously. They sense that he is not acting from impulse, but from intention. And intention, once consistently demonstrated, becomes the foundation of respect. But the most important part of this transformation is not the respect that appears from others. It is the respect a man begins to develop for himself. When he proves to himself repeatedly that temptation does not control him, his confidence stops depending on external approval. He no longer needs constant reassurance because he has already tested his own discipline. At that point, something remarkable happens. The very forces that once distracted him lose their ability to command his attention. Lust becomes just another impulse, not a master. Attraction becomes something he can experience without surrendering control. The world no longer pulls him in every direction because he has learned to choose his direction deliberately. And that is the quiet secret Machiavelli understood about power. It does not begin with controlling others. It begins with refusing to be ruled by impulses that make control possible. If this perspective helped you see power and discipline in a new way, make sure you like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and support the work through the link in the description.